Paul saw paradise, and he still woke up in pain the next morning. That's one of the strangest things in all of 2 Corinthians 12. This is a man who got caught up into the third heaven. He heard words so sacred he wasn't even allowed to repeat them. Most of us will never get that close to glory in our entire lives. And Paul had it. He had the vision, and he still had the thorn. We don't like that. If I'm honest, I don't like that. Because somewhere in our heads we've got this idea that if God really shows up in your life, I mean really shows up, the pain is supposed to go away. You get enough of heaven, and earth should stop hurting so bad. You get that close to glory. Surely God can handle one thorn. But he didn't take it away. And Paul didn't just quietly accept that either. He asked. 3 times he begged the Lord to remove it. He didn't spiritualize it. He didn't put on a brave face and pretend he was fine. He pleaded, and heaven answered him. Just, not with removal. Some of you know exactly what that feels like. You prayed, and the weakness didn't leave. You begged God about it, and woke up the next day, and it was still there. That same struggle, staring you in the face again. You've asked him to take away the thing that keeps humbling you, wearing you out, reminding you that you're not as strong as everybody thinks you are. And maybe the hardest part isn't even the thorn itself. Maybe the hardest part is wondering why God would leave it there. So that's where we're going today, into this strange, uncomfortable space Paul lived in. Paradise on one hand, pain on the other. A prayer that got answered, but not the way he wanted, because this chapter isn't really about a thorn God refused to remove. It's about what grace looks like when he doesn't. Part 1. Heaven did not make Paul untouchable. There's a quiet lie a lot of us carry around. We'd never actually say it out loud, but somewhere underneath we think, if I were closer to God, this wouldn't still hurt so much. Maybe if I prayed harder. Maybe if my faith was bigger. Maybe if God was really pleased with me, I wouldn't keep waking up carrying the same old thing. And then Paul walks into the room and ruins that whole theory. This wasn't some casual believer. This was a man who preached Christ, who suffered for the gospel, who saw things most of us don't have words for. Caught up into the third heaven. That's Paul, and he still had a thorn. Sit with that for a second. Because a lot of us measure our spiritual health by whether or not it still hurts. We look at our thorn and think, something must be wrong with me. But Paul's life is telling us something quieter than that. A thorn doesn't always mean God is far away. Sometimes the person closest to holy things is still the one limping home at night. Some of you know that feeling. You can encourage everybody else in the room and still feel completely worn out when it gets quiet. You can believe every promise in this book and still have one part of your life that feels painfully unfinished. You can genuinely love Jesus and still have a place inside you that keeps whispering, Lord, why is this still here? I want to say this gently. Don't let the thorn become your measuring stick for how close God is to you. Paul saw paradise. Paul carried pain. Both true, at the same time. Maybe that's where some of us need to start today. Not pretending the thorn is small. Not acting like pain just evaporates when your faith is real enough. Just letting Scripture be more honest than we usually let ourselves be. Being close to God doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you held. And that's a very different thing. Untouchable means nothing can wound you. Held means when you get wounded, you don't carry it by yourself. Paul wasn't less loved because the thorn stayed. He wasn't less spiritual for having to ask God for help, again and again and again. Heaven touched Paul's life. It didn't remove every ache from his body. And maybe that's not a contradiction at all. Maybe that's exactly where 2 Corinthians 12 starts speaking to the rest of us. Part 2. The thorn was not the whole story, but it was always there. Paul never tells us what the thorn actually was. And honestly, that's a mercy. Because if he'd named it, some of us would have quietly checked out. Well, that's not my thing. But he leaves it unnamed, and somehow it finds its way into every single room. A thorn isn't always something people can see. Sometimes it's the weakness you manage quietly, the fear that comes back at night, the grief that behaves for a while and then knocks again out of nowhere. Sometimes it's the temptation you thought you'd outgrown years ago, or the wound that doesn't bleed in public but still aches when nobody's looking. That's what makes a thorn exhausting. It doesn't have to wreck your whole life. It just has to keep coming back. Paul calls it something specific, a messenger of Satan, sent to harass him. That word, harass, is important. That's not one big attack you get to recover from. That's the repeated knock, the steady pressure, the voice that won't let you forget your limits. Maybe your thorn talks like that too. Still weak, still stuck. You prayed and nothing changed. But here's what I want you to notice. Paul never says the thorn was the whole story. It was there, sure. It hurt. It humbled him. It just didn't get to own him. The thorn was real. So was Christ. And in this chapter we're about to find out which one actually had the last word. Part 3. Paul prayed like a man who was tired. Now I want you to notice something small here, but really honest. Paul didn't say he accepted the thorn right away. He didn't say he understood it, or that he was spiritual enough to never ask God to take it back. What he actually said was, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. That's not some calm little prayer before dinner. That's a man who is worn out. Have you ever prayed like that? Not with beautiful words, not with a strong voice, just a tired whisper from the same old place. Lord, please, not again. Take this from me. I don't want to keep carrying this. Some prayers sound less like theology and more like breathing through pain. Paul knew those prayers too. The same apostle who wrote about grace also knew what it was to beg for relief. That matters, because a lot of us feel ashamed for asking God the same thing over and over. We think, if my faith were stronger, I'd stop bringing this up. But Paul brought it up 3 times, and the Lord never rebuked him for asking. Let that land for a second. God is not offended by a prayer that comes back with tears still on it. A child doesn't become less loved for showing up to his father holding the same broken place again. So don't clean Paul up too much. Let him be tired here. Let him be a man who loved God deeply and still wanted the pain to stop, because faith isn't pretending the thorn doesn't hurt. Sometimes faith is just bringing it back to Jesus one more time, with nothing impressive left to say except, Lord, I still need you here. Part 4. God said no, but he did not walk away. Now here's the part we have to handle carefully. Paul asked for the thorn to leave, and God said no. Not because Paul used the wrong words, not because his faith was lacking, not because heaven was too busy to notice one aching man. The answer was just no. But it wasn't an empty no. The Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Do you hear how tender that actually is? He didn't say stop talking about it. He didn't say you should be over this by now. He gave Paul himself, right in the exact spot where Paul wanted relief instead. And friend, that's usually not the answer we're asking for. We want the door opened. Sometimes he sits with us in the hallway instead. We want the storm to stop. Sometimes what we get is a hand holding us under the waves. We want the weakness gone, and sometimes all he says is, I'll meet you there. That doesn't make it easy. I'm not saying that. A no from God can still hurt. It can still leave you quiet for a long time. Paul didn't get an explanation. He got a promise strong enough to lean on instead. Maybe that's where some of you are tonight. You didn't get the removal, but you're still here. still breathing, still praying, still being carried in ways you can't fully explain. Maybe grace has been holding you more quietly than you realized. God didn't remove the thorn, but he didn't leave Paul alone with it either. And sometimes the miracle isn't that the pain disappears. Sometimes the miracle is just Christ, closer than the pain ever was. Part 5. Grace was not an explanation. It was enough for the next breath. Now notice what the Lord didn't give Paul here. No long explanation. No here's exactly why I'm allowing this. No timeline. No reveal of how many years the thorn would stay. No pulling back the curtain on the hidden purpose behind it. He just said, "My grace is sufficient for you." And honestly, that can feel hard to sit with, because when we're hurting, we usually want answers. Why did this happen? Why did it stay? Why didn't the prayer end the way we hoped? Ever notice how pain makes you want a map? You want God to show you the whole road ahead. But a lot of times what he gives is just enough light for the next step. Maybe that's what's happening here. Grace isn't God explaining everything to Paul. Grace is God keeping Paul from collapsing while he still doesn't understand everything. That's a different kind of mercy. Not the kind that answers every question before sundown. Not the kind that makes life suddenly easy. The kind that shows up in the morning and says, "There'll be enough for today. Enough to breathe, enough to pray again, enough to take one more step with the thorn still sitting there." We miss that miracle a lot because it's quiet. We're so focused on wanting the thorn gone that we don't notice grace has been carrying us the whole time it stayed. So if you're still here, still turning your heart toward God, still whispering his name with tired faith, don't call that nothing. That might be grace. Not loud, not dramatic, just sufficient. Part 6. The thorn stayed, but it no longer owned Paul. There's something surprising about how Paul lands this. He doesn't say, "I enjoy weakness." Don't misread him here. He's not pretending pain is beautiful, not saying the thorn didn't hurt, not trying to sound brave for the church. What he actually says is, "When I am weak, then I am strong." That's not a man who lost touch with reality. That's a man who found Christ in the exact place he thought would ruin him. And that changes everything, because the thorn stayed, but it stopped owning Paul. It could still trouble him, still humble him, still remind him he was dust. It just couldn't tell him who he was anymore. Maybe that's the freedom some of us actually need. Not freedom from having any weakness at all. Freedom from being ruled by the weakness we still carry. You can have a thorn and still belong to Christ. You can walk with a limp and still be led by God. You can have a place inside you that aches and still carry the power of Jesus. Paul didn't get strong by learning to hide the weakness better. He got strong because he finally stopped pretending it wasn't there. That's a deep kind of rest, honestly. When you stop spending all your strength trying to look untouched, you find out what it actually means to be held. And that's probably why Paul could boast in weakness. Not because weakness was the treasure, because Christ met him right there in it. The thorn had been talking to Paul for a long time, but by the end there was a louder voice in the room. "My grace is sufficient for you." And once that voice got louder, the thorn didn't get the last word anymore. Conclusion. Grace stayed longer than the thorn. Maybe the most honest thing we can say tonight is this. Some thorns just don't leave when we ask them to. Paul knew that. And if you've lived long enough, you probably know it too. There are things you prayed about years ago that you're somehow still praying about right now. Weaknesses you thought would be gone by this point in your life. Aches you don't really talk about anymore. Not because they stopped hurting, but because you got tired of explaining them to people. Maybe that's why this chapter feels so strangely comforting. It doesn't insult us with an easy ending. Paul doesn't walk out of this passage holding the thorn up, smiling because it's finally over. He walks out with the thorn still there, but with another word laid over his life instead. Grace. Not the decorative kind you put on a wall, the kind that keeps a man breathing when the prayer didn't get answered the way he hoped. The kind that shows up in the exact room where you thought God had let you down, and just stays there with you. So maybe the question tonight isn't only why didn't God take this away? Maybe it's something quieter than that. What's actually been carrying me while it stayed? Because if the thorn is still there, and somehow you're still here, still praying, still listening, still reaching toward Christ with tired hands, don't call that nothing. That's grace. Quiet, stubborn, still standing grace. The kind that stays when the pain stays. One day every thorn loses its place. Every weakness goes silent. Every tired prayer finally gets gathered up in his presence. But until that day comes, the thorn might still be in the flesh. Christ is still on the throne. And between the two of them, it's not even close. The thorn doesn't get the last word here. Grace does.